Yeah. Well, President Trump tweeted over the weekend, quote, "If President Obama made the deals that I made, both at the border and for the economy, the corrupt media would be hailing them as incredible, and a national holiday would immediately be declared,
right,
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." And then he does his best Rodney Dangerfield by saying, "I don't get no respect." Well, unfortunately for the president, some of his toughest critiques are now coming from the conservative Wall Street Journal editorial board, who wrote this about the weak job numbers that arrived on Friday. Mika?
Well, he says employers added a mere 75,000 jobs last month, but even these paltry gains were erased by the Labor Department's downward revisions for April and March. Job growth has averaged 164,000 this year, compared to 223,000 in 2018 and 217,000 during Barack Obama's second term. The jobs trend this year is going in the wrong direction. The unemployment rate held at 3.6%. That's the lowest in 50 years. But workers don't appear to be leaving the sidelines like they were last year. The U.S. labor force has lost 583,000 workers since January, the first springtime decline since 2013. As we learned in the Obama years, monetary policy alone can't overcome bad fiscal, trade, or regulatory policy. The May jobs report is a flashing yellow light that Mr. Trump needs to settle his trade wars and get back to promoting growth. Again, that from the Wall Street Journal editorial board.
Steve Ratner, that expression, yellow blinking light, is an expression that you actually used on Friday before the Wall Street Journal editorial was written. We have been hearing, despite, again, numbers that just on the surface look extraordinary, 50-year unemployment rate lows and other really positive areas of the economy, we're starting to hear concerns in the markets. We're starting to hear concerns from about blinking yellow lights, blinking red lights. Tell us about this economy. What can we expect?
Well, that is, of course, the $64,000 question. We're at one of those inflection points where it's really hard to know for sure. But what you have going on at the moment are really two factors that are interacting in a way that's kind of unfortunate. One, you have a general economic slowdown going on around the world for a whole variety of reasons. Europe is a mess. China, we talked about a little bit at the end of the previous hour, has its own set of challenges, and so forth. And the U.S. was on a sugar high, which it couldn't possibly maintain anyway. So you had a drop, particularly in manufacturing output and industrial production around the world. It's even turned negative in some important countries. But then you layer on top of that Trump's trade policies, which have completely discombobulated businessmen, put them in a position of not really knowing how to plan, how to organize their businesses, how to decide on where their supply chain should be, starting to move supply chains out of China and into Southeast Asia. All of these are very disruptive practices, situations that they have to address. And so it has caused a real pulling back. Even the capital expenditure and investment numbers that Trump has been trumpeting, no pun intended, have started to weaken. And so what the Wall Street Journal is saying, quite rightly, is don't use economic tools as a foreign policy weapon. Focus on the economy, focus on your foreign policy, but try to keep them separate and try to remember why, at least we, the Wall Street Journal, were for you, which was because of your policies of deregulation and tax reform and promoting trade, not trying to curb trade. And so the economy, the world's economy is very much at an inflection point. And as I said on Friday, if you look at things like the bond market, which is a pretty accurate predictor of the future, it is flashing, if not red, certainly yellow lights at this point in terms of the possibility that we could tip into a recession sometime in the next year, and all the implications that has for Trump's reelection, because that is, of course, the one issue that he's been able to promote himself on.
Yeah, and Robert Costa, you had investors and middle-class Americans going from worrying about the impact on their jobs and on their wallets of a trade war with China to a trade war with Mexico. Of course, tell us about the Republicans' response to both of these trade wars. It seemed last week that the Republicans were in open revolt. So this deal that Donald Trump pulled together with the Mexicans, whether it's a real deal or not.
New deal.
Whether it's a new deal or an old deal, we'll find out in the weeks to come. But was that made necessary, that quote deal made necessary because of the Republican revolt on the Hill about this trade war with Mexico?
The Wall Street Journal editorial echoes what many of my sources, Republican lawmakers, heard from the business community in their states and district over the weekend. There's a sense that the Federal Reserve and a possible coming rate cut could sustain the market, but they really have fear about the trade war, both with China and with Mexico, specifically with Mexico if you're in the Midwest, and with China as well. And on immigration, there is some skepticism on background, if not always publicly at this moment, against President Trump's deal, because they know that border with the southern border of Mexico is 600 miles long, and they also know that President Lopez Obrador of Mexico was eager to cut a deal. And they're going to have a wait-and-see mentality. They know this White House wants to play to the GOP base ahead of 2020 because Congress isn't appropriating much for the wall at all. And so they know the president is eager to show action. But they also have a wait-and-see approach. Is this actually going to stop the migration coming up from Central America? That's something that conservatives are eyeing already.
Eddie, is this it for the election in 2020? Is it really all about the stock market numbers, the job numbers, the unemployment numbers, and is that going to be what, in the end, determines whether President Trump gets a second term, given that that's what he's run on, given that that's what he's played as his big trump card?
I don't think so. I think they will play a role. It's always been the case, at least among the chattering classes, that it's the economy, stupid, that matters more than anything. I think those real around the kitchen table issues are concerns for everyday ordinary families. How they manifest themselves, even though we have the lowest unemployment rate, however we can describe it, folks are still trying to figure out how they're going to pay for college for their kids, how they're going to make sure they have food on the table, how they're going to pay their bills and the like. But what I'm interested in this moment is that Trump truly believes in tariffs. Without evidence, he believes in the economic value of tariffs. And so what I'm thinking about, is this an ideological dispute within the Republican Party that's now in full view? Because Trump comes in office, in some ways, skeptical of what Bannon and others call the globalist, right? So he doesn't believe in the post-World War II consensus. He doesn't believe in the underlying logic that was NAFTA. He doesn't believe in the philosophy of the global economy. So are we seeing here on the front page, the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, the ideological dispute within the Republican Party that is Trumpism in full view at this point?
One of my obsessions.
Oh, go ahead, John.
I want to share my obsession quickly. Does Trumpism survive Trump? And to go to Professor Glass' point, you have this ideologically incoherent moment, right? To go to the Wall Street Journal, they used to talk about free men, free ideas, and free trade, right? So the free flow of people, the free flow of ideas, the free flow of goods. This is not a coherent chapter in that story. So to what extent was this a genuine conversion of philosophy on the part of the Republican Party? I think de minimis. I think this is a marriage of convenience that they're going to end up regretting.
Well, and John, if you go through the checklist of what the Republican Party has stood for, what the conservative movement has been about, from Edmund Burke through Russell Kirk, through William F. Buckley, through Ronald Reagan, it's free trade, it's free markets, it is a challenge to the Russian menace, it is the standing united with our northern Atlantic allies. It is all the things. It's suspicion. I mean, whether you're talking about JFK speaking in Berlin or Ronald Reagan speaking in Berlin.
Right.
They believed you use the power of the presidency to promote freedom at home and abroad, and not just in warfare, but more importantly for those two, with their words. They stood with the people of Berlin. They stood with the people of Eastern Europe. They stood for democracies over totalitarianism. That has been the core of at least the Republican Party I grew up with, the Republican Party that I learned about at the feet of my father. Right. That's what the Republican Party, that's what conservatism was once about. This moment appears to only be about Trump, unlike Reaganism. Yeah. That's why I don't think Trumpism survives Donald Trump.
You know, Joe, I was going to ask you about just that exact point that you just pointed out. Trumpism, John, you used the phrase Trumpism as if it were an ideology attributable to the Republican Party.
It's a series of symptoms.
That's what it is. It's symptoms. It's not a philosophy. It's not ideology. It's rooted in ignorance of things around us. It's rooted in ignorance of the impact of tariffs, the widespread impact of tariffs. So my question to you would be, Joe, I know what his answer would be. What happens to the Republican Party when Trumpism either fades away, diminishes, he loses, whatever? What happens to those people who are in awe of it right now?
I think, and I do think, I agree with your description of Trumpism. I also think that we would make a mistake to ignore its salience and its power, its populist power to move people, because it's so elemental, it's nativist, it's xenophobic. I mean, so these are recurring features in American life that ebb and flow. Right now they're flowing, we need to find a way to ebb. My own sense, historically, is this is entirely about character as destiny. This is entirely about who steps forward to be the post-Trump figure. And I think we all know, I have no specific knowledge here, but just watching it, the day after the 2020 election, win or lose for the president, Mike Pence is going to be trying to cash in these chips. You know, he has put this guy in a bear hug and is going to want something back, it seems to me. And so who are the people who will step forward and say, we want a restoration drama. We want to make America truly great again, whatever the phrase is. I think it depends. I think the future of the Republican Party depends on who steps forward to lead it.
But I also think...
Sorry. Go ahead.
I was just saying, I also think, Mike, that part of what is going to say to these people who are for Trump at the moment, who believe in Trump, that it really didn't work out so well, is what's going to happen, likely to happen in the economy over the next year and a half. And I think we're going to get to the next election, and you're going to have Democratic candidates, and maybe even some saying, are you really better off than you were 4 years ago? Right. The economy is going to be slower. There's a possibility we're going to be in recession. And most importantly, there's literally nothing in Trump's policies that help the people in Pennsylvania and in Michigan and Wisconsin who elected him. He's not made them better off by one iota. And I think they're going to find themselves that this is not really what we signed up for.
And that's an uncontrollable element, right? Yeah.
There is. And you have people that right now are grasping. They've been grasping for the past 15, 16 years, searching for hope. So many people who voted for Donald Trump across those states we keep mentioning also voted for Barack Obama in 2008. They voted for George W. Bush in 2004, voted for Democratic congressmen who helped elect Nancy Pelosi Speaker in 2006, 2 years after electing Barack Obama in 2008, elected the Tea Party to Congress to check him in 2010. 2 years after that, of course, they went back, re-elected Barack Obama to check the Tea Party. 2 years after that, they elected Republicans again to check Barack Obama, and then Donald Trump got elected in 2016. But you talk about Mike Pence. I can tell you what's going to happen to Mike Pence. The same thing that happened to George W. Bush's people that were all around him. They will not be welcomed into polite society inside or outside of the Republican Party. As Mika, as you know, because unfortunately you had to read them. I've written 3 books, and they're all the same book.
Right.
And they all talk about how republicanism and how conservatism fails when they spend too much money, when they become big government Republicans. Well, you know, and so many other people know, the grief I caught from 2004 through 2008 for criticizing George W. Bush. I was hammered incessantly. Guess what? January 21st, 2009, suddenly everybody agreed with me. Conservatives agreed with me. Republicans agreed with me. Of course, they didn't say we were wrong for kicking you know what out of Joe for the past 4 years. But suddenly it was safe to say what I had been saying for 4 years once George W. Bush left town, and other conservatives were saying it. The Wall Street Journal editorial page in 2004, already talking about big government republicanism on the pages of the Wall Street Journal editorial page in 2004. So there were a few other conservatives criticizing Bush's big government republicanism. Mika, the same thing will happen here. Donald Trump right now is in power. He will not be in power at some point. And when that happens, this, quote, restoration will come as easily as, let's say, a Nikki Haley nomination or a Marco Rubio nomination. Trumpism lives and dies politically with Donald Trump. There is no second act. There is no future. This is a man who supported gun control his entire life. This is a man who supported the bank bailouts. This is a man who supported abortion his entire life. This is a man who in 2009, think about this, in 2009, talked about nationalizing the banks. I'll say it again. A decade ago, Donald Trump supported the big Wall Street bank bailout and even said he would be fine if the federal government nationalized the banks. There is no Trumpism after Trump because Donald Trump believes in nothing other than power. And when that power is gone, Trumpism evaporates with it. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.